Greetings, friends, and welcome to today's webinar. I'd like to mention from the start that there is simultaneous interpretation, English and Spanish. You can click on the language channel of your choice in the icon on the below toolbar. In several countries around the world, entire communities have been denied citizenship, today and also in the past, mainly because of their ethnic origin or descent. In most of these cases, we're talking about minority groups who have been living in the country for generations, and such measures of denial and deprivation of nationality have rendered these communities stateless in situ, meaning without even having to cross an international border. State-sanctioned discriminatory citizenship practices are not new phenomena. In the past, states have often used access to citizenship as a tool to further marginalize minorities whom they do not want to consider as belonging to their citizenry. When sovereignty intersects with racism, which is a product of power and privilege, history has shown us that this nexus sometimes translates into states denying citizenship to entire minority groups who therefore become stateless. It is a means to oppress and to subordinate some groups while reinforcing the privilege of others. As non-citizens, such disenfranchised stateless minorities become extremely vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. Today's webinar conversation, which is brought to you by the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches, will be exploring the following main question. Is statelessness a product of racialized nationality? Our conversation will be moderated by Reverend Dr. Unhcr. An ordained minister of the Church of Sweden, he is a well-renowned scholar in the field of interreligious relations and dialogue. He holds a doctorate of theology from Senate of Serampore College, Kolkata, India. He served for nearly 20 years at the World Council of Churches as program executive of the Office on Interreligious Relations and Dialogue in Geneva. He is the former president of Religions for Peace Europe, and he also served Arigato International in several capacities as an interfaith advisor, as chair of its Council for Prayer and Action for Children, and as council member of the Interfaith Council on Ethics Education for Children. He was also president of the Nordic Gulen Institute and served on the board of trustees of Hartford Seminary. He's a recipient of the Maja Kone Peace Award for the promotion of interreligious harmony, Madurai, India, and the Fethullah Gulen International Dialogue Prize, Copenhagen, Denmark. He holds the 2019-2020 De Roche Chair for Interreligious Research at Nanzan University, Nagoya, Japan. Without further delay, Unhcr, please guide us in this conversation.
Yes, thank you very much for this invitation. I will confess to that I'm of the old generation, hence not so used to Zoom. So bear with me if I make many mistakes, but I understand that Segma will assist me. So to begin with, let me share with you a couple of words. The importance of the existence of statelessness does not have to be argued for this conversation. The world has come across the plight of the Muslim Rohingya, who are rendered stateless in Buddhist majority Myanmar. Migrants from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Ghana are stateless in the Ivory Coast. There are stateless Kurds in Syria, many of Haitian descent, born in the Dominican Republic, live as stateless. Statelessness comes in numbers from several 100,000 to tens of thousands. Together, they are millions. It is more difficult to see the individual stateless. He or she disappears easily among the millions of stateless. You only see the forest and not a single tree. Sometimes it is good to focus only on a single tree. As citizens of a country, we usually take for granted the rights and obligations that citizenship confers. You don't think that there might be people living for decades in your country that they are not citizens like you are. The closest I would get to in Europe about living without nationality and rights is the harsh reality of Roma in Europe. Confronted with the plight of European Roma, one resorts to all kinds of reasons to justify this status quo. Roma in Europe prefer to live in their own Roma communities instead of living together with everyone else in society. Casting all Roma in one role has a background in stereotyping and racism. Racism is built on prejudice and stereotyping, which set the parameters for who is who. Increasingly, this fits the mentality of our time. Identity politics, where identifying factors develop agendas that are based upon these identities. And the sad reality is that the more power an identity carries, the less likely its carrier is aware of it as an identity at all. In this sense, identity is no longer a potential, but a pitfall. I was born in Sweden, stateless. I thought I would be reckoned as a child of my mother, a Swedish Jewish woman, also in terms of citizenship. But I was put in the same category as my father, stateless. My father was a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany. He had to leave his mother behind and fled via Sudetenland and Denmark and managed to get to Sweden. It took him almost 15 years to be given Swedish citizenship. I remembered from early on how he looked upon the citizenship bestowed upon him. It was as if it was given him on condition that he behaved, that he kept a low profile, and not insisted upon that he was also, or could even be, a resource in and for Sweden. I learned as a child unconsciously that we, in relation to Sweden, always were to receive, never ask, never insist, never give. Being stateless in its essence, irrespective of that we had become Swedish, lasted for many years in my life. For my father, his receiving Swedish citizenship, as if on condition, lasted throughout his life. Racism, or in his case, anti-Semitism, was a clear and present danger and could, as he read it, break out any day again, and would then, his Swedish citizenship, really protect him. Racism had, as a defining tool, entered our essence as human beings living as citizens in Sweden. We'd been given a favor being given citizenship, but the statelessness never went away from his mind and soul. You could give the Jew citizenship, but you couldn't take away the statelessness from the Jew. And while the passport now was Swedish, racism was not dead and buried, although Swedes would comfort him and say that it belonged to the 30s and the build-up to the World War II. While it even today is not politically correct to talk about anti-Semitism in Sweden as racism, it was there, although after the war it was considered as antiquated. And yet it remains in the very language. There is a subtle difference when saying he's a real Jew and he is a real Christian. When your self-image is colored by not belonging, one may be reduced to an identity as victim. The field of vision is narrowed down and the horizon is lost. one becomes what those in power say that you are, stateless. We could make a comparison with the self-identity of Dalits, the oppressed in Sanskrit, the name given to those in India who for generations have been subjected to untouchability. Those who do not belong begin to internalize what those who belong say about them. You define yourself as nothing more than as Dalit or stateless. When you internalize what is being said about you, it serves the cause of those in power. The South African anti-apartheid activist, Steve Bantubiko, was right when saying the most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Thank you. And now from this, I go to that which should be maybe much more part of the reality of life as you experience it from various quarters of the world. And I would begin now by introducing Ana Maria Belik. She is the founding member of the network Reconocido, sorry, my Spanish is not what it used to be. And this is about the stateless Dominican of Haitian descent, as I also mentioned before. So I would invite you to share with us how the nationality in your law, in your country, impacts your community and its relation with statelessness. Please.
Muchísimas gracias. Sí,
Thank you very much. I'll try not to speak too fast. It is an honor to be here with all of you and to listen to the testimonies and experiences that you've shared. It makes me feel more comfortable to share my story because I know that you understand the reality of stateless people, not only my reality, but from people all over the world. In the Dominican Republic, in the last 20 years, the laws have changed drastically. These changes in the legislation have restricted more and more the possibilities to access nationality for the children of Haitian immigrants who were born in the Dominican Republic. In 1999, the Inter-American Court for Human Rights gave a punishment to the Dominican Republic and ruled against the Dominican Republic for not acknowledging these children. And they created a law for nationality recognition. So the court was inviting the country to modify their internal laws if it was needed, so no children would be left without a nationality. However, after these measures were taken, the internal actions in the country were even more restrictive. They are more restrictive. And in 2010, therefore, we've seen that the Constitution at an internal level, the Constitution was modified to restrict all the ways through which a person can access nationality. And it was then when the category of transit was created, putting all undocumented persons in a category called a transitional category. For example, my mom was in the country for over 40 years, but if she's a migrant and if she doesn't have a permanent residency, then she'll be considered as a person in transit, not even like an illegal immigrant. And if she had a child, the child would not be able to acquire the Dominican nationality. In 2013, after several actions taken, we had a case in the Constitutional Tribunal and the Constitutional Tribunal made a decision against recognizing the nationality of Juliana Deyes, not only her nationality, but many other people who were in the same condition, and they did it in a retroactive ways. So from 1929 to present. What does that mean? So anybody born before that year and who were in the same condition as Juliana didn't have access to obtaining their nationality. So our right to nationality, our right to documentation was violated. So that was the ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal, and that gave this illegal practice, or this unjustified practice, they gave it some legal framework. So this is a policy that we call a denaturalization practice, which is taking away the nationality of people who were born in the Dominican Republic, who had the right to a nationality, and that at a certain point in their lives, they started changing the law and their access to nationality was denied. Many efforts have been made to restitute or to change this this ruling, an 168 ruling, to restitute the nationality for those people, but it has not been possible because they have not been able to recover their nationality, and there has not been any policies or political will to change this. We've seen in the country a division from people born in the Dominican Republic or of Haitian, from Haiti, and there is a difference between being born before 2010 or after 2010, before the law or after the law. So this has caused a lot of division. One of the most difficult things right now is that we don't have political will. The government has no interest in promoting a solution to this problem. Up until 2016, the international community was following closely what was happening in the Dominican Republic, and now everybody has lost interest. The government has been lobbying at an international level for that, to make people believe that the problem was solved with an internal law that was approved in the Congress, but this is not true. The problem is not solved. People are still living without a nationality. Many boys and girls are born without access to a nationality, without the possibility to get a birth certificate, not even a birth certificate. So all these channels are closed. We don't have any alternative ways to promote or help these people, help them recover their nationality or getting it for the first time, or having a document that would make them legal and would reduce their vulnerability. So this is the situation we're facing right now in the Dominican Republic. Very recently, the Dominican government started applying laws, putting laws into force to state that, for example, the hospitals would only give assistance to those with documentation, with any sort of ID or legal documentation, even though we know that access to health should be equal for everyone. And today we see people in our country who are not migrants, who were born in this country, but have absolutely no document whatsoever to prove their nationality. And because of that, they cannot have access to the healthcare system. I'd like to share a case as an example. One of my colleagues who, just like me, is the daughter of a Haitian couple. She never had documents. She never had documentation, and she gave birth to a baby that has some health issues. Her baby needs medical attention. But when she went to the hospital, she was told that she could not receive any help because her baby was stateless and she couldn't provide any sort of ID, any document. And for that reason, because her baby did not have a birth certificate, she was left without medical assistance. That's just to illustrate how this lack of documentation is affecting the lives of people in my country and how it's generating more and more generations of stateless people. This person I just mentioned she has no means to solve her problem, and the baby has even less tools to access his nationality or any sort of documentation. We are in the process to help her and other persons in the same situation, at least to have access to the health system. But this, the problem of the lack of documentation and nationality is much more complex because it depends on the political will of our government. And we know that is non-existent at the moment. So that would be my intervention, and so that we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now turn, I think I see whom I believe to be Professor Fernand de Varenne, and who has then been able to join us from his meeting or whatever it was at the UN. So welcome. You are the United Nations Special Rapporteur on minority issues. And I would invite you to say a little about the intersection between statelessness, minorities, and racial discrimination. How does racism feed statelessness? Please.
Many thanks, Reverend Uko, colleagues and friends. Bonjour tout le monde. Apologies for being late. I was presenting a report to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. Let me also thank the World Council of Churches for the privilege of being amongst such a distinguished panel, and congratulate it also on such a timely webinar. Timely because, well, we in the world are facing another significant failure, as we did in the case of 1 million Rohingya who were stripped of citizenship in Myanmar from about the 1980s. Today, right now, the international community is perhaps again failing in preventing millions more, as we've heard also in the Dominican Republic, but also millions more in India losing their citizenship and eventually becoming stateless. Although not exactly because of their ethnicity or race, but because perhaps more for most of them, their religion. And we need to keep that in mind also. And I think it's important to set out the context, which leads to many, in fact, I would say most cases of statelessness. The vast majority of stateless people are denied or stripped of citizenship in violation of international human rights law. More than 3/4 of them, well, essentially because they belong to an ethnic, religious, or even linguistic minority in some cases. But let me emphasize this point. It is illegal. It is against the law. It needs to be called out. It is against international human rights law. Unfortunately, in my opinion, and I will allow myself to be critical, the Unhcr has failed to do so, even though it is the United Nations agency entrusted with responsibilities for stateless persons generally, and with the responsibility for the prevention and reduction of statelessness. But let me be very clear here. Statelessness has not ended. Statelessness has not been reduced. Statelessness has actually not even stagnated. It's increasing, so that some observers believe we may have gone from some 10 million stateless people at the beginning of the UNHCR I Belong campaign to eradicate statelessness by 2024 to perhaps even closer now today to 15 million. There have been notable successes. There's, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, which essentially has eliminated statelessness. But I think we could add, some significant steps in Côte d'Ivoire. And of course, there are legal challenges that have been effective to remove the obstacles for women in particular to obtain or be recognized citizenship. But the overall reality is that efforts have largely, to use a colloquial expression, been chipping away at the edges and failed because there's been a failure to recognize and prioritize efforts where they are most needed. Needed in relation to people of Haitian descent, as we just heard from the Dominican Republic. The illegal denial of citizenship targeting mainly minorities, because the Haitian people in the Dominican Republic are minorities because of their race or ethnicity, and more recently, we're beginning to see more and more because of their religion. And perhaps we need to be reminded of a not so distant, shameful past, and how some members of the Jewish minority were stripped of their citizenship in Nazi Germany, much as today we are seeing millions of Muslims who are finding themselves also threatened in India. The Rohingya minority in Myanmar, Muslims and Bengali descent minorities in India, Roma and Russian-speaking minorities in Europe, the Haitian descent minority in the Dominican Republic, and other minorities are the largest groups affected when we talk about statelessness around the world. This is not accidental or the result of bad or inconsiderate policies. They are essentially mainly the result of continuing discriminatory practices, policies, and legislation that actually targets especially certain minorities in violation of global, legal, and moral standards. I repeat, we have situations of violations of the law, violations of international human rights law, and this needs to be called out much more loudly than it currently is. In which it should be clear that to really have an impact, to really lower the levels of statelessness, requires focusing on what most causes these cases. And that means we need to prioritize and have approaches and measures that recognize and tries to address intentional targeting and discrimination against most victims of statelessness around the world. But, and as an independent expert, I must say that we look around and we can see, in my opinion, an international community's failure to do so. And I have not heard many recent pronouncements from the UNHCR on the global and potentially crisis of millions more becoming stateless in India, and which will overshadow, by the way, what happened in Myanmar and the extremely grave humanitarian crisis that the statelessness of one people caused in that country and eventually in the region itself. In fact, you can just imagine that if we've had such a significant crisis with 1 million people, Rohingya, a minority, becoming stateless, and what this has caused in terms of human suffering and even atrocities. Imagine what will occur if we have millions and millions more in India becoming stateless because of religious differences in the main. We should focus on not letting countries such as Myanmar and the Dominican Republic and India getting away with discrimination that is in violation of international law. Discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, or language, which actually has the result that millions of minorities are being denied citizenship because of the color of their skin, or the God they pray to, or the sound of their voices. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. You raised some very important issues, and in a way, I hope we can get back to what Anna Maria said and you said in order to kind of, among ourselves, highlight some of the emphasis that we see on those issues that you mentioned. Now, I think I am to turn to, please help me. I am to turn to
Amal de Chikara.
Amal de Chikara, who I will say belongs to and has founded the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion and has his home base, I think, in Sri Lanka, if I'm not mistaken from the name. So please, Amal, the floor is yours. And the question that I wanted to share with you, some of the world's largest stateless communities live in Asia. According to the Unhcr statistics, 40% of the identified stateless population of the world live in Asia and the Pacific. And the question would be, would you say that racial discrimination plays a role in their difficulty to access nationality? Please.
Thank you very much, Reverend Uko, and my thanks to SEGMA and all other colleagues at the World Council of Churches for putting on this very timely event, as Professor Fernando also mentioned. My thanks to the three speakers before me, actually, for kind of laying the groundwork for this session so eloquently and powerfully. Fernando always speaks very passionately about the impact of discrimination, particularly on minorities, and that's a sentiment that I very much share. And indeed, as I will go on to elaborate in my answer, we too are of the view, and I think it's irrefutable actually, that discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, etc., targeting minority communities is the most significant cause of statelessness around the world. Thanks also to Anna Maria for, I think, so very clearly articulating what I would term as the technology of bureaucratic exclusion, which is the process through which the Dominican Republic, through laws and policies and decrees, creates an argument to justify the frankly unjustifiable. And if we look at the treatment of minorities around the world who have been made stateless, we find a similar experience of statelessness being driven by discriminatory and unjust laws and policies, and those laws and policies then being used to give a veneer of credibility to what is being done in terms of inflicting real violence on entire communities. So the short answer to your question is, it absolutely plays a part. I think it's also important to recognize that discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, etc., does also intersect with other forms of discrimination, which make particular people more vulnerable to statelessness, but also more vulnerable to the impacts of statelessness. For example, when ethnic discrimination intersects with sex discrimination in Nepal, you would find that women from the Dalit community are more likely to be denied the right to pass citizenship onto their children, as opposed to women from the Brahmin community. Similarly, you would find that disabled children are less likely to be able to access citizenship due to discrimination both on the side of the state as well as on the side of society, as opposed to able-bodied children who also come from the same minority communities. I think when reflecting on the impact of race discrimination, ethnic discrimination, discrimination on the basis of religion, and the way it relates to statelessness, it's also worth asking the question, why? So why is it that statelessness is viewed as, or the imposition of statelessness through the arbitrary deprivation of nationality is viewed as a strategic objective of states that wish to exclude certain groups? And I think there, when we ask that question, we realize that weaponizing citizenship can often be in the interest of bad faith actors that are states. And it can be a weapon through which they actually can bring some legitimacy and justification to the discrimination that they would anyway be inflicting on certain communities. And what I mean by this is, if you take the Rohingyas' experience in Myanmar, for example, while the Rohingya, before they were stateless, were also victims of discrimination, once they were made stateless, the narrative behind that discrimination was justified on the basis that they are not one of us, that they don't deserve our protection because they are not from here. And that's a very dangerous narrative, which alters histories, which alters identity, which alters the relationship between minority communities and other communities in the same state. And it's a narrative which empowers racist elements in society and populist elements in society in ways that are very dangerous as well. Let me end with two final thoughts. I think if you look at the types of communities in Asia, the large communities in Asia, which are stateless because of discrimination, you can point to the Rohingya, obviously, the hill tribes in Thailand, communities in Vietnam and Cambodia, the Bajau Laut in Malaysia, and many others. But I would also like to draw attention to two other types of communities that are in a very precarious position. And which shows, I think this, Hans, this goes to the comment you made about the fact that statelessness never leaves you. And one is in situations where statelessness has actually been resolved, where the basis of deprivation of nationality to begin with was racism or discrimination on the basis of ethnicity. Even the formal adoption of citizenship status doesn't immediately bring that community back onto an equal footing. It doesn't change the way the majority population identifies with and responds to that community. And I can take the example from my own country, Sri Lanka, where you have the hill country Tamil community who were made stateless. I mean, the history is one of colonization and this community being brought to Sri Lanka from India to work in plantations. They were made stateless, but finally in the 2000s, that situation was officially resolved. However, today they remain by all markers the most disadvantaged community in Sri Lanka. And you speak to any regular Sri Lankan and you ask them about the community, and they will be identified as Indian Tamils. So their association is still as foreigner. And the second and final reflection I would like to make, and this goes to Professor Fanon's point about the situation in Assam, is that when you belong to a minority community, even if you have citizenship, that citizenship is always in a precarious position. It's contingent on good behavior. It's contingent on the shifting political mood. That's very much what's happened in Assam, where there's been a growth of nationalism, both Assamese nationalism and Hindu nationalism. This community, largely of Bengali origin, has been disproportionately targeted. But it's also the case with the Urdu-speaking community in Bangladesh, who were made stateless and who then got their citizenship through a Supreme Court judgment, but who still face challenges accessing documentation, proving that they are Bangladeshi, and therefore they constantly have to establish and re-establish and re-establish their right to be considered Bangladeshi citizens. And this is the real violence of discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity, and the way it impacts on minority communities who are told, you don't belong, or you belong, but only because we say you do, or you only half belong and we will tolerate you, but you better behave well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It kind of echoes a bit what I said about belonging, but on condition that you behave. We will now turn to Sam Mosalai, representing UNHCR and the I Belong campaign. And I turn over the floor to you, please.
Thank you very much, Hans, for giving me the floor. And I should also start by thanking the World Council of Churches for allowing us to be part of this conversation, and also thanking Anna and Hans for both for sharing their story today. I think very powerful and very important that we hear these stories. I also echo what Fernand de Varenne and Amal have said about the importance of having this conversation, about the importance of keep addressing these issues, because as we know, discrimination on various grounds is one of the main causes of statelessness worldwide, as has been said by previous speakers. So it's very important that we continue to address these issues. In terms of global trends, when we look at global trends in terms of racial and ethnic discrimination and nationality laws, I should start by saying that we don't have an exact number of countries that discriminate on that basis. Not as we have with, for instance, sex discrimination, where it's quite clear how many countries in which parts of the world discriminate against women in transferring nationality, and we have quite a good understanding of the issues. We did last year publish a background note on various forms of discrimination and nationality laws as Unhcr, and we also organized a high-level event together with OHCHR, for which we did background research and issued a background note. And based on the background research that we did for that, we can say that there's at least 20 countries in the world that currently have discriminatory elements based on race and ethnicity in their nationality laws. 20 countries seems like maybe a small number relatively, but as we've heard from other speakers, the number of stateless persons that come from these countries are very, very large, are massive. And here we are speaking, of course, about Myanmar, with the Rohingya. We speak about the Dominican Republic, the persons of Haitian descent, also ethnic Kurds in Syria and Bidun in Gulf countries, and to a lesser extent, Roma and Sinti in Europe. So even though the number of countries is relatively small, the number of stateless people that it produces is very, very large. These 20 countries, I should say, also do not look at discrimination in policy and practice. So we don't dare look at discrimination in applying the law. We know that there's many, there can be many administrative obstacles for people to access a nationality. And we also know that in many contexts, this primarily affects people of ethnic, racial minorities and other minorities, religious minorities, as we've heard. So the 20 countries is really looking at the law and doesn't necessarily include all the various ways in which people face discrimination in accessing nationality. So that's something that we should keep in mind as well. What is, in light of this, knowing that there's such large numbers of stateless people coming from countries that maintain racial and ethnic discrimination, it is rather disappointing to see that out of the 270 pledges that we've received at the high-level segment and the Global Refugee Forum in 2019, only 2 of them concern Action 4 of our Global Action Plan, which is about removing discriminatory provisions from nationality laws. Only 2 pledges were received, which may point towards a lack of political will to resolve some of these issues and to address some of these issues. The countries that have pledged to take action are Uganda and the Republic of Congo. And Uganda has indicated at the event that I mentioned before that we organized last year that they are working to review their nationality laws to make progress on implementing their pledge, which is positive. As I said, it's not so positive that there's only been 2 pledges, which shows or may point towards a lack of political will to resolve these issues. But we have seen in the past that achievements are made even without pledges, and maybe not directly related to racial and ethnic discrimination, but we've seen, for instance, that Iran in 2019 made significant progress when it comes to removing sex discrimination from the nationality laws, without having made a pledge to that effect. So action is possible even without pledges, but certainly it's something to keep in mind, and to keep looking at, and as UNHCR, of course, with our partners, we continue to work to address these issues. So that's it from my side.
Thank you ever so much. Do I understand it correctly that we now will have among the panelists a kind of internal discussion? Or so help me, please, Segma. I'm lost among the papers here.
No problem. Thank you to all the speakers for the very insightful presentations. This is the short time for Q&A, where we would be welcoming some questions from the floor. And there is one actually in the chat room, but also a moment where maybe the panelists would have questions and comments to one another. So the question that we have right now is, minorities are among the most vulnerable groups around the world. Yet there is no there's no international instrument specifically dedicated to minority groups. What are the prospects of an international treaty on minority groups? And would that help improve the situation of stateless people? I think that's a question that would be fitted for Professor Armand Varel, but maybe others also could respond to that. And if the absence of such a treaty also would be a justification for what is happening.
Merci beaucoup. That is a very good question. There are two ways of answering it. One, any clarification of the rights of minorities will actually be useful in terms of actually trying to work at their effective implementation. So on the one hand, any move in this direction, including clarifying what is the prohibition or the effects of the prohibition of discrimination in relation to citizenship, would be useful. And I would imagine that if there was a treaty on the rights of minorities, that the issue of citizenship should be part of that new instrument, new document. Unfortunately, let's just say that there may not be a lot of appetite within the United Nations for a new human rights treaty. However, having said that, this year is the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Minorities. And we are having this year quite a few events around that anniversary. And one of the aspects of the anniversary that has been coming up from the bottom up, if you will, is a great deal of suggestion that perhaps the time has come to have a dialogue, a conversation on the need to actually better protect minorities, because at this point we don't have enough clarity in many aspects. So there are currently, in fact, some discussions that are starting in the need to a better protection of the rights of minorities, because in statelessness and other areas, they are the main targets, and therefore we need to perhaps have greater clarity and definition of what is a non-discriminatory approach for minorities in areas such as statelessness. So difficult, but there is perhaps some movement in this direction in the international United Nations system.
Thank you, Professor. If you allow me, moderator, there is another question, this time from our friend Unhcr from Malaysia. One of the causes of statelessness is due to ideas of patriarchy and matrimony. On the one hand, it is the idea that the nationality of a child follows that of its father, not mother, where father and mother are legally married to each other. And the other is in the case of an unwed mother, where the child does not inherit the nationality of its father. For the panelists, have you come across such situations? And if so, what can be done to resolve the problem of statelessness in these instances? Anyone with you? Amal? I see, and maybe Sam later.
Thank you, and thank you, Andrew, for that question. I think it's self-evident that any kind of legal discrimination or discrimination in the law, I shouldn't say legal discrimination in the law which denies mothers equal rights to pass citizenship onto their children, or women equal rights to pass citizenship onto their spouses, can result in statelessness. And I mean, there are 25 countries in the world, which when you say 25 countries, it maybe doesn't sound that much, but that's 1/8 of the countries in the world which discriminate on this basis. And there are actually 50 countries, or quarter of the countries in the world, which discriminate against women in some way in terms of the acquisition and retention of their own nationality. And particularly where this then intersects, as I mentioned in my previous intervention, with other forms of discrimination as well, it can and it does result in statelessness. But I think there's also a more fundamental kind of underlying question that this type of discrimination deteriorates the equality of women as kind of equal participants in democracies. And the fact that in today's world, it can be seen as acceptable that women are not equal agents and equal actors in a country's democracy, and they don't have the same citizenship and democratic rights as men is truly problematic. There is actually a webinar being organized by Equality Bahamas on Saturday, which I will also be speaking at, and at which there will be some fantastic colleagues from Malaysia, as well as Catherine Harrington from the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights, who will be actually together dissecting this issue. I'll try and find the link and put it in the chat. But I would encourage anyone who's more interested in that issue to attend that webinar. And if I may also just respond to the previous question in terms of kind of is now the right time for a convention on minority rights. I mean, I would leave it to the experts on minority rights to answer that question as Fernand has, but I would just add that let's not forget, it's very clear under international law as it currently stands that this type of discrimination against minorities is unlawful, and the resultant statelessness is unlawful. So we already do have the tools to deal with this problem from an international law perspective, and adding more tools which may clarify further and which may provide a more rounded understanding, whilst welcome, it won't take away the fact that we are failing to do our job with the existing tools that we have. And so I think it's worth focusing a lot of attention on the fact, similarly to the way the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights has really shed a spotlight on the countries which discriminate on the basis of gender, to really shed a spotlight on the countries which discriminate on the basis of race, ethnicity, etc., and to draw attention to this very significant challenge.
Thank you, Amol. I'm seeing a number of questions in the chat room as well as in the Q&A section. If you allow me, let me quickly read them and then invite you to briefly answer them in a minute or two maximum, because we're running out of time, I'm being told, and we still have the second half of the webinar to go through. So the questions we have, Reverend Dr. Cornelia Fulkrut-Weitzer, who's saying, Professor de Varenne mentioned the start of a dialogue on the rights of minorities. What are the major stumbling blocks and actors against an improvement? Next question would be Jennifer Martin from Jamaica, Canacom. Thanks for the contribution from the Dominican Republic. Is there much progress in lobbying the government to grant legal status to Haitian descent persons born in the DR? Emo Yango from Canada. Refugee camps have been utilized to supposedly temporarily house refugees, yet refugee camps have housed perhaps the greatest number of stateless people, Palestinians in Lebanon, Karens in Thailand. Perhaps it's about time to recognize and identify that refugee camps have become part of a systemic or institutional racism. If this premise is agreeable to the panel, what is then the alternatives? Because if we don't have any other options, then what are we complicit to? Then we are complicit to racism. So that's Emo. And last question is from Greece. Professor de Varenne has mentioned several times that Unhcr has failed to prevent and reduce the deterioration of the statelessness. Is there a comment or reaction from Sam Mosaila? I think we will hold with these questions, and maybe if you have some reactions, brief ones, and then later on, maybe we can interact in the chat room.
And doesn't Anna Maria also, you raised as if you had an issue to raise. So maybe we should provide space for that as well, and then maybe turn to the second half of this event.
Sí, muchas gracias. Yo solo quería
Thank
hacer
you. I just wanted to connect the connection, make the connection between the patriarchy question and my reality. Here in the Dominican Republic, we have a different reality in the sense that the laws here stated that parents, fathers would be the ones registering the children, but this has been changed. And now it's something that has been shown as one of the greatest developments in our country is the fact that women can do this alone now. However, this paradoxically is a progress that has become a trap, because if the mother doesn't have documentation and the father has, the mother is not allowed to declare the birth of the child. And the father cannot do it alone either, even if he has documentation, because the mother doesn't have documents. And this is something that is preventing the access of children born in the Dominican Republic to the access of nationality, because they use this technicism in order to prevent people from registering the birth of their children. And this is the reason why we also have a lot of people in this situation, because since, for instance, me as a woman, I don't have documents or papers, but my spouse, my husband, do have legal documents. When we go to register the birth of our kid, the authorities they oblige me to have legal documents. And if I don't have these documents, then I cannot register my child. And therefore, the child becomes vulnerable. Another situation we see is that in the hospitals, there are differences between children born from foreign mothers and from national mothers. And there is a difference between what is called the pink book and the Dominican book. Therefore, since children are born, there is this stigma. And as I mentioned, our reality here is documented with all the migratory issue. And since we are Black women and also from Haitian descent, when we go to hospitals, we are not seen as nationals, we are seen as migrants. And if we do not have legal papers, then this aggravates our situation. And the person working in the hospital believes that if you don't have documents, you are an immigrant, and therefore your child will be considered as a foreign. There have been some developments in this situation, but as I said, these problems are very important for our communities, because we see that this is not something that is enshrined in laws, but something that is being practiced for many, many years in the practicalities of the day-to-day work at hospitals. So despite having the opportunity of registering our children ourselves, this has also become a hindrance for national men to register the children if the mother has no legal status in the country. Therefore, I would like to mention this example because, as we can see, these can look like a progressive measure, but in our example brings a lot of problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, how do we, I realize we have exactly 30 minutes and there were some questions raised. And would it be possible for the panel to address these without repeating them now, taking more time, and in a way just highlight that you have taken this on board, and then to see how this could continue. So who feels, who would like to address one of these questions? Yes.
Merci beaucoup. Let me try to summarize. There were two questions, and I'll try to respond with a more general reaction. I think it is extremely important that we focus on prevention to avoid generations of people being marginalized by the flow down effects, negative consequences of denial of citizenship. This is something Amal mentioned earlier, because it's not only one individual losing citizenship, it can be generations that flow after that, as we're seeing also in the Dominican Republic. And hence my urgent call, in a sense, that we are in a particular context, I believe, where there are millions more individuals that are at the risk of losing citizenship or being denied citizenship in Assam, India currently. There is a process called the National Registry of Citizens, which could, at this point, suggest that there might even be almost 2 million people who would not be recognized as citizens. They are mainly of Muslim and Bengali minorities. And that's only the beginning. There are other potential processes occurring in India that could perhaps lead to many more millions. And I emphasize once again that aspect because it is much better to try to focus on the cases which haven't quite reached the level where we will have millions more people who become stateless. I think the international community failed in relation to the Rohingya in the 1980s. We should have been focusing much more on what was being done from a legal point of view, in fact, in a discriminatory way by the government, the authorities in the Republic of Myanmar. We failed to do so, in my opinion, in the 1980s and 90s. And now we have this huge humanitarian crisis, which is actually having an extremely heavy human toll. Right now, we have the possibility of preventing, perhaps, many more millions becoming stateless if the Unhcr focuses on Assam and India to try to prevent the legal process and other processes that might eventually lead to millions losing their citizenship. I think we have to talk about this in a preventive, the Unhcr has a preventive mandate, and now is the time to actually go in this direction rather than to try to address the subsequent horrific consequences it'll have on generations if we allow millions of people in the next few years to become stateless. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. I forgot your name, but
no worries, Sam.
Sam.
Yes. I'll quickly come in. I maybe first to again echo what has been said, that I agree that when the question is what do we do to address some of these issues, sex discrimination, racism, ultimately we need to address the root causes, and the root cause of sex discrimination is gender inequality. So we do need to, and the same with racism and racist nationality laws that lead to statelessness. We need to address the root causes, and we need to really also invest in peace building and ensuring that communities live together in harmony. So I think addressing the root causes is extremely important. Another question I think that was addressed to me was about I think the comment that was made by Professor de Varenne about UNHCR's campaign not being as effective as we would have liked it to be, and that we have maybe not succeeded in reducing statelessness. And I think that is correct to some extent. I think the campaign has been successful in some ways. It has raised awareness on the issue of statelessness. There's a lot more organizations in civil society now working on the issue. We see that stateless communities are empowered and more vocal than before. But we also see that, unfortunately, this hasn't necessarily led to a reduction in the number of stateless persons. And you know, we'll come to this later as well. But you know, we've had evaluations looking at the work that we have done as Unhcr and the effectiveness of the campaign, and you know, rightfully, one of the conclusions is that more could have been done. And more needs to be done. And in response to that, we will be redoubling our efforts in the final years of the campaign, and we will be looking at you know, what will follow the campaign, what will follow 2024, and how can we work together with others to make sure that that's effective as possible. The issue of in India, in Assam state in India, is of course very sensitive, and it is something that we are aware of, that we're monitoring, that our office in India is monitoring very closely, that our colleagues in Thailand in the regional bureau are monitoring very closely. And it's something that we will address where possible. But it is a very sensitive issue, and we will be following up with our colleagues on the ground to see what it is that we can do.
Thank you. Now we turn to the second part, and so now in very short answers because we are running out of time. So to Anna Maria, please, from your perspective, has the current COVID-19 pandemic affected the situation of stateless people and heightened their vulnerability?
Bueno, sí, la pandemia ha puesto en evidencia
The
cosas.
pandemic has made evident some elements and some failures of society and the government, which is that the lack of documentation and the lack of access to nationality limits the access of persons to a legal status. Just to give you an example, in the Dominican Republic, the government implemented a series of measures, social measures to contrast the effects of the pandemic. However, all these measures from the government were meant for those persons with documentation, with an ID. So all those undocumented persons could not benefit from any of the packages or help from the government during the pandemic. When we received the vaccines, for example, all the vaccination campaigns were meant for those people who were documented, and all the undocumented people did not have access to the vaccines. So that was a discriminatory practice. All of those without an ID could not even think of getting a vaccine. They were not taken into account. And they also did not receive any sort of economic support. So the pandemic made it even more clear how vulnerable the undocumented people are in our society, and how thousands of people were left behind and outside of this basic care, such as health or humanitarian aid. So the pandemic really made this clear, this difference, and we've carried out several actions, and we have heavily criticized these actions, because we're not discriminating foreigners, we're also discriminating against people who were born in the Dominican Republic. So the government should take care of all the citizens regardless of their status. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We go from one issue maybe to the other. So now I would like to address Professor Fernand de Varenne and Amal de Shikera on how can we address the perceived tension between state prerogative in determining who belongs to its citizenry and the right of every person to a nationality. What needs to be done to challenge stereotypes and dismantle structural discrimination? it says here 3 minutes each. I don't know if we manage this, but at least highlight some of the major issues at stake.
I will let Amal go first because I haven't heard him for a while. Please.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it is possible to view these two principles as being in tension with each other. So I think it's uncontroversial to say that states have the sovereignty to determine the rules of who is a citizen and who isn't. At the same time, every individual has a right to nationality. But I think these two principles only come into tension with each other if a state acts in bad faith. By that, what I mean is if a state decides to act unlawfully against principles and norms of international law, to discriminate, to arbitrarily deprive nationality, to create statelessness, then it is in those situations where this tension arises. And I think if you look at the evolution of human rights law in other areas, what we have seen is that it's the norm that international law provides a frame around within which states can use their discretion. And this frame is there to protect individuals and to protect individual rights. So it's completely uncontroversial, for example, to say that states don't have a sovereign right to torture individuals. Whereas if you go back a few centuries, it was common practice for states to torture individuals, and that was fine. And I think it's equally legitimate to say that states don't have a right to have discriminatory nationality laws, to arbitrarily deprive nationality, to deprive nationality where there are disproportionate impacts on the enjoyment of other human rights, and to cause statelessness. Now, all of these issues around the frame within which a state must operate are actually addressed in the principles on national deprivation as a counter-security measure, which our organization has kind of been involved in. And next week, we will actually be launching a new report which looks at the citizenship deprivation practices of all of the states in the world. And if you're interested in kind of exploring this area of the statelessness issue more, I would welcome you to join that event, and I'll share the link in the chat. But basically, I don't think there is a tension unless that tension is forced by a state that is acting in bad faith.
So, Fernand de Varenne, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. Je vais répondre en français. No, I'm just kidding.
Oui, allez-y.
I completely agree with what Amal has just mentioned. It was interesting, the word prerogative, because it seems to suggest that it's really at the full discretion of the state, but as we just heard, it is not. Citizenship determination matters now fall clearly within the restrictions, if you will, of the limitations of international human rights law, and is particularly, I would suggest, the prohibition of discrimination. I think what would be an addition, or perhaps needed to acknowledge, is that on the one hand, the international treaties that we had that deal with statelessness or stateless issues go back to the 1950s and 60s. They were rather early international human rights documents. And in a way, perhaps some aspects of these are rather archaic, or should actually be better developed or clarified, as in the case of guidelines, which can be very useful. And here is perhaps the need for a new instrument, particularly in relation to areas of religious, cultural, linguistic preferences that we're seeing more and more that can lead to statelessness, that certain individuals are denied citizenship because they don't belong to the right culture or religion. And this can be very, very subtle in the way that these preferences might impact on minorities and exclude them from citizenship. So perhaps all of that to say that maybe it is time for greater clarification that actually gives the contours of what exactly states can do in the types of preferences that can actually have a disproportionate effect on the citizenship of minorities through religious or cultural or other types of preferences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to turn now to Sam from UNHCR and ask a question relating to UNHCR and the campaign Then I Belong. how do you see things improving in the remaining 2 years left of the campaign? Will there be another campaign, another decade? 2 minutes, and I understand it's not very polite to say so, but go.
No worries. I'll try to stick to 2 minutes. Yeah, as you said, there's a bit over 2 years left until the end of the campaign. It started in 2014. Will run until 2024, and it's clear, and we've touched on it just now before. It is clear that we're not going to be achieving the goals of the campaign. We're not going to be ending statelessness by 2024, which was the goal of the campaign when it was launched 10 years ago. There's not going to be another 10 years, but we are thinking within the organization of what should follow it. And as most of you will know by now, there have been 2 evaluations into UNHCR statelessness work. As I mentioned before, one has been conducted by UNHCR, one has been conducted by PRM, by the US State Department, and both of them conclude more or less the same. And one of the main findings is that, as I said, despite the campaign having raised awareness on the topic, it has not been as successful as it was envisioned to be, and the goals have been too ambitious. And one of the recommendations there is for UNHCR is to reprioritize the issue within the organization, and to really elevate statelessness within all divisions and departments within the organization. And luckily, what is positive is that our senior management has made very serious commitments to redouble our efforts, as I said before, in the final years of the campaign. And we're also looking at what will follow the campaign. And in that sense, we're looking at potentially building a coalition, or building a coalition, or potentially we are building a coalition with various stakeholders that is supposed to sort of take the work of the campaign forward. And this multi-stakeholder coalition is supposed to replace some of the fragmented bilateral partnerships that we've had in the past 10 years, and really make sure that there's a concerted effort towards ending statelessness. And what is probably important to mention is that it will not only include civil society, UN agencies, and states to some extent, but it will primarily also include stateless persons themselves. We're really looking to empower stateless persons more than we've already done going forward, to make sure that they can be the voice of change, and that they can share their experiences. So these are some of the plans that we have for after 2024, and hopefully that will help us to continue to work.
I'm an ignoramus here, but I was surprised that you say that we need to empower stateless persons. So that means that up until now, people have been speaking for stateless persons, and stateless persons have kind of been quiet until, or communicated their grievances through someone else then, or please enlighten me on that one.
I mean, of course, we have been working with stateless persons in the past, as UNHCR, and civil society does the same. Our partners work with stateless persons, and we do try to give them a platform when we organize events and so on. But we think that there is room for improvement, let's say. Not only every event should have someone who's personally affected by statelessness, but we should have a more we should have a more consistent approach, let's say, to this. And so we're looking to see how can we really involve stateless persons in everything that we do, in all the work that we do going forward. So it's really making it more consistent, let's say.
So thank you. I think that without making it happy end Hollywood style, maybe it would be good to kind of see which would be the piste à suivre for you towards something that you on the way have found to be positive developments and events that where you can see, yes, this is the way to go ahead, so that we kind of end this webinar by asking you all panelists what gives you hope regarding the fight to end statelessness. We have now hardly 9 minutes left, so 1.5 minutes or so, and then to wrap it all up. And thank you for your excellent contributions. So who would like to begin? Someone who's bold enough? And yes, Fernand de Varenne.
Merci beaucoup, merci énormément. We perhaps have a golden opportunity to help prevent millions of more people becoming stateless in India. The process is not finished. India is going through the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review, at the UN Human Rights Council in November of this year. Maybe it's a time to actually raise this issue as a very grave matter of concern, but in the hope that actually a saner, more balanced views will prevail. So perhaps, being an optimist, this is the time for all those who are very much involved in the era of statelessness to work together to try to highlight the need to ensure that millions of people are not denied citizenship. So let's be optimistic and be one of our priorities for this year.
Thank you. Yes, Ana Maria.
Sí, bueno, yo pienso que
Yes. I believe that one of the positive aspects that I see is to make more awareness raising around statelessness, as in the Dominican Republic, as an island with a lot of interlinkages between racism and immigration. We have been speaking about this, and also with Amal, with the Institute, we have been working and connecting the dots and connecting with other people that work around the stateless people or that are stateless people themselves. So I believe that all these is pushing forward the discussion and also the visibility of our communities. And I believe this is a very positive aspect. I would like to see how in the future we can engage international institutions more into this subject. And also, since we are also speaking within the churches as well, I would also like to see the churches more involved into this situation, especially here in my country. We see that most of people belong to a church. They are religious. However, the commitment of some religious leaders is very limited around this situation. Therefore, I would love to see more engagement with the churches, and I would like maybe the WCC help us engage all these religious leaders into this reality, because something is clear. All these people that are stateless, they belong to the community as well, and we cannot deny the religious component of the social situation that people undergo. Therefore, I would love to kindly ask you and urge you to help us connect churches with the reality on the ground and with the stateless people in our countries. And of course, with international agencies as well. Let us find a way to connect with each other, because sometimes we see that this only involves the most bureaucratic part of the state. And as we see in the Dominican Republic, they have been very good at lying to people and saying, no, we are doing a lot of things in terms of statelessness. But as I am on the ground, I know this is not the case. However, many international institutions believe the state when they say, no, we don't have stateless people, we don't have any discrimination against them. But I tell you, I am on the ground and this is happening every day and this is real, this is not a lie. Therefore, I believe we need to stop believing these lies and try to connect more with the people on the ground. But I believe in these churches have a pivotal role and they should play this role more actively within this reality. And this is something I would like to mention. And I thank you very much for the opportunity given. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sam or Amal or...
I'm sorry, Sam, you go.
No, please go ahead, Amal, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think I'll make 3 very quick points. Firstly, I think if you take a slightly longer lens view and look at, say, over the last 10 to 15 years, you would find that there's now far greater recognition that statelessness is fundamentally and squarely a human rights issue. And gone are the days when we would talk about statelessness as being an accident of conflict of laws. And there's recognition that statelessness is a result of a violation of the right to nationality. It's a result of discrimination, and it must be treated and responded through using human rights and anti-discrimination tools. Secondly, and I think the COVID-19 pandemic, which Anna Maria also spoke about, had a lot to do with this, in that it's becoming increasingly difficult for a range of actors to ignore statelessness and ignore the fact that statelessness fundamentally impacts on what it is they're trying to do. Whether you're a healthcare actor or an education actor or a women's rights actor or a humanitarian actor or whatever else it may be, it's very clear that the structural discrimination and disadvantage that's associated with statelessness means that stateless people are disadvantaged in relation to accessing a whole range of rights and services. And this really came out in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the structural discrimination that stateless people anyway endure, but which was invisible to wider society, suddenly came to the forefront because stateless people were denied vaccines and stateless people were denied access to emergency healthcare, and stateless people were denied access to the relief packages that governments were kind of putting out to their citizens. And I think that the final point I want to make, and this also echoes what Anna Maria made, the point that Anna Maria made, is that I think those of us in the statelessness field are getting more organized. And we are getting more organized in a way which I believe is genuinely trying to grapple with the fact that historically, the statelessness field has failed to center stateless people. And this is something that Sam mentioned as well. And historically, there have been all of these power imbalances and resource imbalances within the statelessness field, which there is now recognition needs to be addressed, or growing recognition, I should say, that people like Anna Maria need to be at the center of the conversation. And people like Sam and Fernand and myself, we need to be accountable to them, and we need to be taking direction from them. And I feel like this is happening slowly. It's not happening in a perfect way, but it is happening slowly, and I think we will be better and stronger for it. So let me end there.
Thank you very much. And Sam, please, you have the last word then in the panel.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I'll again echo what has been said already. I think the fact that there's now a stronger civil society, there's more engagement on the issue of statelessness. The fact that also in the past few years we've seen protests and demonstrations and people getting more aware of marginalized groups and power imbalances and inequalities and really people standing up for their rights. I think that's very positive, and I think that goes hand in hand with what we're trying to do is give a platform to stateless persons and yeah, take a step back sometimes and listen to people who who live the life of stateless persons, and that's very important. And I think that's a very positive development, that there's more people are more vocal, and there's more of a push, and there's more accountability in that sense as well.
Thank you. Segma will tell you something about publications coming out of this. I would like to mention, which I think in a way echoes the expectations that one may have on not only churches, but religious communities, and that this maybe is the venue for a true interreligious cooperation. I see that the Pope, in his message for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees, said, "We are all in the same boat and called to work together." So I think that the millions of stateless people have expectations that those who come up with nice declarations and so on also try to incarnate them in common action. And I think that is one of the major avenues for true interreligious cooperation. A book was published where I had the pleasure to contribute, building upon the title of the UNHCR campaign, I Belong, but I leave now to Segma to continue on this issue in the volume 2 of this, on this issue.
Thank you so much, Hans, and thank you so much, all of you speakers. I really appreciate that you took the time to join us during this conversation, which is quite timely and very important, and really wanted to acknowledge your presence among us and also your contributions. As Hans mentioned, we had a first publication a few years ago where we encouraged several theologians, including himself, to reflect on different dimensions of statelessness, and be it gender discrimination, non-discrimination, and other aspects. And we have now prepared a second volume, and the second volume will be again focusing on different aspects of statelessness, and it will be theological reflections. Two of the contributors actually are attending this webinar. We have Reverend Dr. Conrad Reiser, former General Secretary, who's one of the contributors, and also Dr. Elizabeth Joy. They are among those who are listening today. And the list of the contributors you can see listed here. The book will be launched today, and you will find more information. I will be sharing in the chat room the link. And so this second volume is called I Belong, Biblical Reflection on Statelessness, and it presents new perspectives, including indigenous voices and reflections on the meaning of land. And here you will find texts which are valuable tools for discussion and reflection during Bible studies in congregations and communities worldwide. And this book can be ordered in WCC publications, but it's also available for free in PDF, downloadable from our website. So this would be the announcement for today. And thank you so much to all of you who have joined us during this webinar. We are really grateful that you have been with us during this conversation, and we hope that we will meet again soon in another webinar, specifically relating to the issue of statelessness again. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Au revoir. Au revoir tout le monde.
Merci beaucoup, Professor. Thank you, Hans, for the moderation. It was excellent. Thank you.
À la prochaine. Au revoir.
À la prochaine, ouais.